Hello, Paulo.
Hello.
You are okay. We had some troubles with Doctora Rosa Isabel. I think she is having a hurricane there where she is located in Mexico. So if you agree, we can start.
Okay.
So for this moment, we have now 121 participants. Thank you very much, all of you. I'm very welcome to this project, to this new project for us in ProAsecal Quality Consulting. It is very, very big pleasure for me to welcome everyone. For now, I can tell you, Paulo, we have people from Argentina, Panama, Ecuador, Mexico, and Colombia. And then, well, and some people are getting the session. So if you agree, please let me introduce myself. I am Hugo Baez. I am general manager from quality consulting and administration manager from ProAsecal in Colombia. And it is a big pleasure for me to welcome everyone. And we will start with this first event, our first InterQC topics. Please, Andres, could you share me the presentation of CV of Dr. Paulo? Okay. Thank you. Dr. Paulo Pereira, he's from Portugal. He lives in Lisbon. He's professor of Instituto Português do Sangue e Transplantação. Paulo, I think I will I will need your help because this is in Portuguese. So if I pronounce, is this correct? If Sangue is another
Yes.
institute.
Yeah, I think
researcher.
I'm a senior postdoc researcher and the head of the research and development department in the Portuguese Institute of Blood and Transplantation. I don't know exactly how to say in Spanish, sorry.
It's okay, it's okay. Researcher in QMS and technical requirements in medical laboratories and blood, cells, and tissues banks. Specialties, methods, test selection, verification and validation, internal quality control, external quality assessment, proficiency testing, measurement uncertainty, reference intervals, metrology, QMS, SPC in the blood components production. The next one, please. The next page, please. This is this the events you usually participate, Paulo? You are a member of quantitative analysis working group in the EURAChem, in the Clinical and Laboratory Standards Institute, technical expert for reviewing the EP12 document, provide feedback and assist the committee in addressing the comments that were received during the public review. Also in Instituto Politécnico de Lisboa, Departamento das Ciências e Tecnologias Laboratoriais e Saúde Comunitária, in Lisbon, where he is professor, control de qualidade laboratorial en the Master of Science, Tecnologías Clínico-Laboratoriais. The next one, please. In the Instituto Português do Sangue da Transplantação, Research, Innovation and Development Department in Portugal. He's coordinator, and the description is development of study and research in transfusion medicine and transplantation, development and innovation activities in which the institution participates at national, European, and international level. And with Westgard QC, he is contributing editor, author of original scientific publications, trainer in actions within the scope of laboratory quality control. Next one, please. Well, it is a huge CV. And as you can see, we have here a very expert in QC. So please enjoy him. So please asking him whatever you need to know. Paulo, again, thank you so much. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay, I think I can start, right?
Yes, please, you can.
Okay. So depending on yesterday, be good morning, good afternoon, good evening, or good night. This first slide was a summary. It was an introduction for me. So, but I think Dr. Hugo Baez already done this work. So I think I don't need to present this slide. So it's so, but just a note, of course, like we are talking about the performance assessment of qualitative tests. I'm closely involved in documents related to this issue, like the Eurochem guide, the CLSI EP 1283, which will be published in next September. So the contents of this presentation. So we'll try to answer to the following questions. What is a qualitative test procedure? What is performance assessment of qualitatives? What is uncertainty assessment of qualitatives? What is an internal quality control in qualitative tests? Finally, what is an external quality assessment in qualitative tests? Some case studies will be discussed for a more practical understanding. Just a note, the presentation reflects the personal opinion, not the opinion of the organizations and projects in which I am involved. So let's start with the first topic. What is a qualitative test procedure? In vitro diagnostic examinations report either the value or characteristics of a clinical property. Quantitative measurement procedures measure and report the value of a property of clinical samples. Qualitative examinations of clinical samples report characteristics of a property by placing them into categories. Binary and order, called nominal, and ordered, called ordinal categorizations. Later, we'll see some examples to show these categories. And the examination results are called qualitative. This is some principles. The meaning of a qualitative value is given in the examination procedure, another principle. There is a lack of harmonization between the different qualitative guides, including the terminology. This is a problem when you are dealing with performance assessment of this type of tests. The IFCC and UPAC vocabulary is strongly suggested. It could be downloaded for free. So what is the difference between quantitative and qualitative testing? For a more straightforward explanation, we will compare the results of a quantitative test with a qualitative one. Numerical results characterize, in this case, 140 millimoles per liter versus a positive result. So the result is given by a measurement procedure in a qualitative test, recognized, as I said, as a quantitative. A reference interval can clinically interpret the result. For example, on the normal range, positive is characterized by descriptive rather than numerical, like a positive result. So the result is given by an examination, recognized as a qualitative test. Diagnostic can clinically interpret this result. For example, infected. Going into some details, we'll see that the difference do not extend only to the dimension of the expression. Let us compare the quantitative sodium versus the qualitative SARS-CoV-2 tests. Sodium is one of the body's electrolytes. It is determined the concentration activity expressed by a numerical value. For example, as we've seen, 140 millimoles per liter. Sodium concentration in body has a small biological variation. Reference interval is between 135 and 145 millimoles per liter. On this type of tests, so we're talking about quantitatives, validation is based mainly on the total analytical error concept involving standard deviation and bias. Allowable total error is a size that is clinically not significant. Well, we know that total error was never recognized by methodology, but it continues to be used by most medical labs, hence the reference. Now see what happens with the qualitative tests. In this case, SARS-CoV-2 tests. We know that the coronavirus is the agent that caused COVID-19. So it is the cause of the pandemic, something associated with transmissible agents, which is not happening with quantitative tests, for example, clinical chemistry tests. Screening and epidemiological surveillance tests are required to detect this type of agent or the immune response, something that is only associated with this type of tests. So the infection is detected directly via viral RNA fractions or indirectly via antibodies. Binary result is qualitative. Positive, negative results are reported. Validation is based on proportions of true results by clinical sensitivity and specificity. Therefore, the performance assessment methodology differs as a whole from that used in quantitative. So target clinical sensitivity and clinical specificity are required. Another almost exclusive perspective of qualitative virological screening tests, for example, SARS-CoV-2 infection curve. So we have here the magnitude of the response and here the number of days post-infections. So the minimum viral load required of nucleic acid amplification tests is between 1 and 5 days. For serological tests, it is at least 7 days after symptom onset, but it could be up to 12 days. The incubation period is interpreted at the time between the day 0 of infection and onset of symptoms. This is a well-recognized scientific basis for determining which screening and epidemiological surveillance tests are. So the screening test is a real-time PCR to identify virus RNA. And the epidemiological surveillance test is the immunoassay to detect SARS-CoV-2 antibodies. So now binary, nominal, and ordinal categorizations. How do you categorize qualitative results? To be simpler, let's consider binary results, positive, negative. To understand better, let's see 4 test examples to categorize qualitative results into positive or negative. Unlike quantitative analysis, qualitative analysis is reported by qualitative results, such as I said, positive or negative, or pass or fail. The qualitative tests differ from the quantitative tests principally because the property has no size. For example, dichotomous results. Now, some examples. We'll see, as I said, 4 examples of qualitative tests. The first one, the blood typing where agglutination classifies a red blood cell type, in this case, an A positive. The colored line used in an hepatitis C virus rapid test is another example. The colored line has no size, so it does not express a quantitative result, but a qualitative level. In this case, 2 distinct colored lines appear, one on the control region and another in the test region. The result test is interpreted as positive. Remember that in the principles we introduced 2 types of categorization. So these are examples of binary categorizations, which are nominal, given there is no underlying quantity scale. Another example, an immunoassay to detect IgG and IgM antibodies of SARS-CoV-2. In this case, what is measured is a signal which cannot be proportional to the antibodies due to factors such as the affinity and avidity. Cutoffs, as you know, is decision value. So a positive sample has a signal that is greater than or equal to the cutoff. This signal classifies the sample result as positive. A negative sample is a signal that is lower than the cutoff. This signal classifies the sample result as negative. In the case of competitive immunoassays, it is the reverse. Finally, the real-time PCR to detect SARS-CoV-2 RNA. Results equal or higher than 95% limit of detection are classified as positives. For example, classification of the number of copies per milliliter. Lower results are classified as negatives. So, these 2 categorizations are ordinal, given there is an underlying quantity scale. So I see some principles of qualitative tests. Now we will see the second topic. What is performance assessment of qualitatives? To better understand performance assessment in the context of the medical laboratory, we will briefly discuss 3 requirements to which it is associated. These requirements are selection, verification, and validation of tests or methods, following ISO 15189. So what is the selection of a test? Selection is the action or fact of carefully choosing someone or something as being the best or most suitable. We interpret suitable as the right or appropriate for a particular test. For example, suitable to a clinical diagnosis, human blood components validation, or blood alcohol content. ISO 15189 requires selection of examination procedures which have been validated for their intended use. So we are talking about which test or method to select before verification or validation stages. Therefore, mainly manufacturer data is used to evaluate if the claimed requirements are fulfilled. So target clinical sensitivity and specificity is required here in the selection. So What is the verification of a test? Verification is the provision of objective evidence that a given item fulfills specified requirements. ISO 15189 requires that validated examination procedures used without notification shall be subject to independent verification by the laboratory before being introduced into routine use. So the shall is a requirement. So this is where most of the commercially available in vitro medical diagnostic tests fall. The laboratory shall obtain information from the manufacturing method developer for confirming the performance characteristics of the procedure. Finally, the independent verification by the laboratory shall confirm, through obtaining objective evidence, that the performance claims for the examination procedure have been met. So the laboratory verifies that it achieves the manufacturer's claimed performance, which it was accepted since it is a selected test. Now, what is the validation of a test? Validation is the verification where the specified requirements are adequate for an intended use. So validation is for ensuring the acceptability of the implemented test. During the validation, our objective is to determine if the test is capable of its intended use and if the test is relevant to the customer's needs. The laboratory shall validate examination procedures derived from the following sources: non-standard methods, laboratory designed or developed methods, standard methods used outside their intended scope, validated methods subsequently modified. For example, in-house tests or modified tests. The validation shall be as extensive as is necessary. And it should confirm through the provision of objective evidence in the form of performance characteristics that the specific requirements for the intended use of the examination have been fulfilled. We note that performance characteristics of an examination procedure should include clinical sensitivity and specificity. Of course, the target sensitivity and specificity, such as in verification, should be consistent with the target in the selection. So it makes, of course, all the sense that the target to use in the selection is the same that you use in the verification and in the validation. Now, let's see what sources of uncertainty do you have in the performance assessment in qualitative tests. I think this slide is very important to understand sometimes what you're, of course, measuring in the performance assessment. First, we consider sources of uncertainty as those that can produce biased results. So in this case, false results. That is our major concern. To be more straightforward, let's take, for example, a virological screening test in a blood bank. So the figure illustrates some significant contributors to the misclassification of qualitative results. In the case of the blood bank, the biggest concern is reporting false negatives. These results represent a high risk of post-transfusion infection. So let's see these major sources of uncertainty. Let's start with biological variation, whether inter-individual or inter-individual. For example, immunity varies across the individual daily cycle or between individuals, as we have seen in this pandemic. This is a source of uncertainty for immunoassays. The second source is the epidemiological prevalence, which is dynamic and subject to change due to new variants or mutations. Another one is the blood bank screening interview, which depends on not only the blood donor candidate certainty, but also the physician interpretation. Next one is the seroconversion window period, the viral load. They are immediately identified as probably as one of the most critical contributions to uncertainty. Seronegative results and the viral load lower than the limit of detection are a source of false negatives. They can be seen as a contributor to the residual risk of post-transfusion infection, because this is something that we need to consider, of course, the risk of this type of adverse event. Next is are interferences, which can be biological or chemical. Another cause of uncertainty is, of course, false results. As we have seen in the blood bank, one of the most adverse risks is post-transfusion infection. Finally, the uncertainty of proportions and measurement uncertainty, which we will briefly discuss later. So if you compare these types of uncertainty with those of quantitative tests, and even more, if you compare this with those of pure chemistry, we see that the uncertainty is very complex in these types of tests that are using for the virological screening. This is much more complex than for the quantitative tests. And as I said, it's very important to be understand. So now, what is the effect of precision and bias on the cutoff trueness? So let's now focus on one of the sources of uncertainty, again, the false results. For a more critical explanation, we will assume the problem in a blood bank screening immunoassay as a weak concentration for a specific microbiological agent. We will see to what extent the standard deviation and bias associated with the cutoff can contribute to false results. This figure illustrates three possible cutoffs computed in routine practice. And of course, if the cutoff is biased, of course, there is a risk, significant or not, of false results. So in this histogram, we can see the ideal case of a cutoff computed with non-significant imprecision and unbiased data. This flat histogram shows the case of a cutoff determined with unbiased data, but highly imprecise. So the results on this case, the results close to the cutoff, have also high probability of being misclassified. So the risk of false results, of course, in this one is higher. Finally, this graph represents the example of a cutoff calculus with precise, so have here a small standard deviation, but of course, but critically biased data. So in these graphics, the risk of misclassification is high due to the low representativeness of the decision cutoff. In these two, the yellow, this on the red. So this one is due to, of course, random error. This one is due to a systematic error. So the impact of randomness and bias on cutoff should be controlled. For example, the use of a gray zone to reduce the chance of misclassification. We note that the entire cutoff is subject to random and systematic error, which is only significant when it contributes to false results. We also note that the cutoff is defined based on the clinical sensitivity-specificity trade-off, which mostly favors sensitivity. For example, this kind of bias and imprecision, this kind of effect on the cutoff, of course, is more critical in the blood bank than in a pathology laboratory. Another important source of uncertainty. What is the risk of misclassifying weak signals? Remember that this is the major problem to false results. So the results close to the cutoff, of course, is the results with a major risk to be misclassified. So for a better understanding of the cycles, we will consider samples from infected and healthy individuals. Let's consider the signal to cutoff ratio, where the cutoff is 1. As we saw, the cutoff is a decision point for the classification. In this hypothetical case, in infinite, all samples are classified as true positives and true negatives. So as we see in this case, we have the negative results. They are not close to the cutoff. So the results, if you are using here cycle to the cutoff ratio, they are very, very low ratio. The positive results, we have a high, very high cutoff ratio, cycle to cutoff ratio. So the chance to have here false results caused by imprecision and bias, of course, is close to 0. So in this hypothetical case, in infinite, all samples are classified as true results, positive or negatives. So in this case, the clinical sensitivity and clinical specificity, they are 100. However, a scenario without the risk of false results is unrealistic, as happened in this figure. So in this case, there is no seroconversion period which supports unreality among other factors. So this figure illustrates only true results. So it is only a theoretical scenario. It is not a practical scenario. It's not what happens in the field. So what is recommended approach for performance assessment? Well, we agree that the primary model for regulatory agencies, industry, CLSCI, and EURECAM for performance assessment of MedLab qualitative tests is the clinical performance evaluation based on Bayesian probabilities. So sensitivity is defined as the percentage of subjects with a target condition whose test values are positive. On the other hand, specificity is defined as the percentage of subjects without a target condition whose negative test values are, of course, negative. So high false negative rate is related to less sensitive tests, and the high false positive rate is related to less specific tests. Well, high clinical sensitivity is the one that fits the purpose of a screening test. These contingency tables allows the calculation of various probabilities, like we'll see in the next slides. However, clinical sensitivity and specificity are the most important from the perspective of laboratory performance assessment. So, to measure the performance assessment, of course, you need to compute the clinical specificity, that is, of course, related to the chance of positive samples to report positive results. And of course, we'll need, of course, to compute also the clinical specificity that is related to the chance to have negative results on negative samples. But otherwise, from the physician's perspective, what is important, it's not, of course, the clinical sensitivity and specificity, but the predictive values, which we not discuss in this lesson. So this scenario, in this scenario, of course, there is always a risk of misclassification. We have here a risk of false negative results, and we have here a risk of false positive results. So this is a real world scenario. This is what happens in the real world. So what is the recommended approach for performance assessment? So as you see, we need to compute sensitivity. Sensitivity is defined, again, let me repeat, as the percentage of subjects with a target condition whose test values are positive. So This is, of course, we have here, of course, the true positive results that you see here in this square, true positive results, divided by the number of true positive results and the number of false negative results. So when you have a clinical sensitivity equal to 100%, of course, the number of false negative results must be, of course, 0. The other measurement needed is a clinical specificity. So it's computed using this mathematical model. So it's the number of true negative results divided by the sum of the true negative results. Sorry, this is not a division. This is wrong. This is plus. So this is a sum. Sorry. So this is the sum of the true negative results with the false positive results. So when you have a clinical specificity of 100%, of course, the number of false positives is 0. We'll see this, of course, in some examples. So, which samples are required to compute the clinical sensitivity and specificity? As we saw, the clinical specificity evaluation requires samples from individuals with a specific condition, such as an infection. The samples should be representative of the epidemiological prevalence of the agent. So it could include several types and subtypes of agents. For small laboratories, it is not always possible to find this sample panel. For example, the clinical sensitivity could be, of course, unknown for some subtypes. Even if they exist in the market, they are costly. So these panels are costly, being an option mainly for manufacturers of in vitro medical diagnostic devices. Now let's discuss the samples of individuals without a true condition. The specificity evaluation requires samples from individuals without a specific target condition as controls, such as non-infected individuals, sometimes abbreviated to D0. These samples should not have known interference factors to minimize the risk of untrue biased binary results. Samples of donors with continuous approved donations are an example of real non-infected samples. So you can ask for support from a closed blood bank. Note that the samples should have a diagnosis, of course. And of course, for example, if you have someone with an infection, a diagnosis is required. But of course, a diagnosis is also when a subject to the blood bank is considered not infected. So the diagnosis is critical and is required to compute the clinical sensitivity and specificity. So now let's talk about what is the uncertainty assessment of qualitatives. So let's start with the concept that was introduced in some papers and again in the EuroChem guideline for the performance assessment of qualitatives. So uncertainty of proportions is the statistical quality of the estimated result rate that depends on the number of samples tested and the number of false results. It is also known as condition uncertainty. It's typically calculated for the 95% confidence level. So a wide 95% confidence interval for clinical sensitivity indicates that the binary result has a significant chance to be misclassified, so to produce false negatives. Otherwise, a wide 95% confidence interval for clinical specificity indicates that the binary result has a significant chance to be misclassified. In this case, false positives. So you have uncertainty related, of course, to the clinical sensitivity and specificity. This is very important to be computed because, of course, it relates our results to a chance of misclassification. Since the result rates are not estimated from any prior knowledge of the population of cases, these intervals only characterize estimated analytical performance quality. So the interpretation of the 95% confidence interval is to some degree similar to what happens with the expanded measurement uncertainty. For a 95% confidence interval, there is a 5% probability that the true value of the result rate is outside the confidence interval limits. Similarly, the 95% confidence interval for an experimentally determined rate provides the statistical uncertainty for the calculated rate. So how to calculate the uncertainty of proportions? Excuse me. Well, the mathematical models for clinical sensitivity, 95% confidence interval shown here, are taken from InterQC CTAC guide. They are, of course, also available in the CLSI EP12. They use the same model. It's called the score confidence interval, which was introduced by Wilson in 1927. This is also recognized by several other agencies, not only CLSI and InterQC. So there is to be introduced in a standard spreadsheet file. The models, of course, are closed to the uncertainty of diagnostic specificity. So they are based in the same mold, so they are closed. So have here the slides, and this is, of course, it's easy to place in the spreadsheet file. So what is the number of samples suitable to calculate uncertainty of proportions? So we saw that to compute clinical sensitivity and clinical specificity, we need to have a diagnosis for both samples. We have, for example, we need to have samples from infected individuals, and you need to have samples from non-infected individuals. Okay. Now we are discussing the number of samples, because number of samples is very important for the uncertainty of proportions. So the selection of the target for 95% confidence interval is associated with the number of samples. This figure represents the dependence of the lower limit of confidence from the number of samples for a sample size of 100. For example, for a number of 30, the target can never be higher than 89%, as this is the best low limit for this number. So when you choose the target lower limit for the 95% confidence interval, if you are using only 30 samples, we cannot have a lower limit better than 89%. So when you are deciding about this target value, we need, of course, to be according to the number of samples. The medical laboratory wishes to set a higher goal. The number of samples should be, of course, increased. Simulation can be quickly done in a spreadsheet. Well, now we hope there is no reason to choose, of course, an impossible limit. You cannot choose, as I said, for this one, a limit of 99%. Another important question related to the performance assessment. Can measurement uncertainty apply to qualitative ones? Yes, but only for tests with ordinal categorization. Since measurement uncertainty is for quantitative results, it is not suitable for pure qualitative results. As far as we know, there are 2 papers published that compute measurement uncertainty on tests with an ordinal scale on the cutoff. So for your information, this article from Pereira et al. Computed the measurement uncertainty of signals results close to the cutoff. They used the measurement to compute the equivocal zone, also known as gray zone, in the MedLab, also known in chemistry as guard band. The other paper by Wen et al. Computed the measurement uncertainty based principally on external quality assessment data. Let's see some study cases of verification that could be applied to verification or validation. In this case, the results of clinical sensitivity and specificity are strongly supported by true binary results. As you can see in this case, we have a clinical specificity of 100%. Sorry. We also have a clinical specificity of 100%. So the information we receive from this clinical accuracy is, of course, that in these samples, all the infected samples are positive and all the non-infected samples are negative. If you see the uncertainty of proportions, we see that it varies from 89% to 100%. They are equal because number of samples are also equal to determine the clinical sensitivity and the clinical specificity. So the clinical sensitivity and specificity satisfy the claimed targets in this case. The target was 100% for sensitivity, 90% for specificity. The 95% confidence interval target lower limit is 85% for sensitivity and 80% for specificity. So, therefore, as the absolute values are equal or higher than the targets in the confidence interval are lower limits are equal or higher than both target lower limits, the test performance is acceptable. So the medical laboratory defines a sensitivity goal according to the intended use of the results. In a blood bank, of course, it is expected that the target sensitivity is 100% because, of course, our fear is the false negative results. Our fear is not the false positive results. So the goals should be carefully chosen when the impact of false negative results is critical. Let's see an example now of the binary examination. So when we talk about binary examination, the binary examination is when we don't know the diagnosis. This should only happen, of course, with rare tests, such as in-house tests. When you are using commercial tests, you should not use, of course, a binary examination agreement, and because there are some limits. So this is only for rare tests, because in this situation, when you are using the binary examination agreement, we don't know the diagnosis. So we only have the results of a comparative test. So we know that the results in the comparative tests for these samples are positive, and for these samples are all negative in the comparative tests. So we cannot say these positives are true positives or these negatives are true negative results. So the mathematical models are similar to those used on the clinical sensitivity and specificity. For further details you could see, of course, for example, the Eurochemistry tech guide. Sorry. In this approach, the clinical sensitivity and specificity are replaced by the percentage of positive agreements and negative agreements. It is critical to select a comparator at the state-of-the-art performance to minimize the risk of misclassification, misevaluation. Of course, you need to take all the care if the comparative test results, if the performance of this test is worse than, of course, the candidate test. So we can see that the positive agreement is 100%, which satisfies the target agreement, such as the 95% confidence interval target lower limit. We can also see that the negative agreement is 90%, which also satisfies the target agreement, such as the 95% confidence interval target lower limit. So we could also accept this test. For, of course, the clinical sensitivity, but in this way, you could also accept. So what is an internal quality control in qualitative tests? This is the next topic. So to discuss this issue, let's first start with to discuss the in-kit versus independent QC material. Of course, when you're talking about performance assessment, as you saw previously, using that Bayesian models, the Bayesian models are the models used to compute the clinical specificity and the clinical sensitivity. And you saw also models to compute the uncertainty of the proportions. As you saw, the performance assessment, of course, involves a lot of requirements. So we cannot use all that conditions to, in the analytical runs, verify if our results is according to what is claimed. So to check in our analytical runs if the performance assessment is, of course, acceptable, we need to have an internal quality control strategy. The sample that you are using is, of course, critical and is, of course, important for the reliability of the approach. So one of the first questions that used to happen is, of course, if the in-kit quality control materials are useful for the internal quality control. So manufacturer positive negative materials are intended to compute the cutoff. That's their purpose. So they are intended to validate the cutoff based on manufacturer-dependent criteria. So in-kit negative materials fits the purpose of negative results control. So manufacturers' positive materials are not the best choice for internal QC. So if you could use a negative material as a control, but if you are using for the internal quality control, and we need, of course, to use a weak sample, of course, the positive materials that are in the kit, of course, are not suitable. They are not, of course, the best choice for the internal quality control. So internal quality control, how can we monitor our results? So independent controls, of course, whenever possible. So whenever possible, you should produce or purchase quality control materials. Internal QC materials are available from third parties. Material concentrations should fit the purpose of the internal QC clinical purpose. Weak positives are available for major MedLab instrument tests. Weak positives can be, of course, human samples. For some rare tests, sometimes this type of internal quality control samples could be, of course, produced in the medical laboratory. Of course, usually you need to deal with all other issues, such as the stability. So we need to take a lot of care, of course, with the sample that you are using, as we will discuss in the next study cases. So let's see now some cases of internal quality control with qualitative tests to better understanding the approach. So the first one involves a real-time PCR SARS-CoV-2 RNA. So this is a real-time PCR test. So we are using an attribute charts. Have here the control examination number. Have here the binary results, positive or negative. Have here two zones. This is the agreement zone. And this is the discrepant zone. So here we have true results. Here we have false results. So a quality control material with a concentration close to 95% limit of detection is used. So it is a weak positive concentration. On this case, this point represents an out of control results, which suggests possible instability in the method. It is clinically important since it represents a false negative result. So, of course, we have a chance that the human samples present in the analytical run could be also false negatives. And of course, we are talking not samples with high concentrations, with high signals, but samples, of course, with low signal. So this result suggests a possible clinically significant risk. So the result of the analytical run in which it happened are rejected. So corrective action, preventive action is required. All the other results, of course, are in agreement zone. So they match. So they are in control, but this one is out of control. Let's see now a second case. So this is the example of controlling binary results of anti-SARS-CoV-2 IgG/IgM immunoassay. So here we are not controlling only the binary result, we are controlling the ratio. So whenever the qualitative result is based on a cutoff and an ordinal scale value, such has happened with immunoassays, of course, and this scale value is numerical, and in which a result is classified as positive or negative depending on the cutoff point, the use of Levy-Jennings charts is a more powerful tool because you will receive information here in internal control that is not possible from an attribute chart. Of course, when this is not possible, as in the previous case, you should use the attribute charts. So Levy-Jennings charts allow illustrating random and systematic error such as trends. That's not possible in a qualitative results chart. Levy-Jennings charts design requires the standard deviation and the mean. The results, such as signal to cutoff ratios, must comply with defined rule or rules. This case uses a single rule of 1/3 standard deviation. So results out of control are those out of the average plus minus 3 standard deviation. So the chance to violate the rule is close to 0.1% in stable conditions. So we have a risk to be out of control, which is very, very short. So if you have a result out of control as this one, of course, there is a high chance of you have a critical issue. The 1/2 standard deviation rule can be used in conjunction with the 1/3 standard deviation, but only as a warning, as it has a high probability of false rejection. So in this case, we have here a violation of this rule. So in fact, what we control can be referred to as a loss of clinical sensitivity of the test, which is related to the risk of false negatives. The limit here, of course, is illustrated by the red side. Rule violation is identified as we saw. In this example, there is a risk of incorrect classification of positives with an average close to 1.75 signal to cutoff ratio. So the run results are rejected and the corrective action, preventive action applied. Note that the classical Westcott rules do not fit the purpose of qualitative tests. They fit the purpose of quantitative tests. Its application is a well-known factor of false alarms. Note this in this case, if the rejection rule was of course in this side, it could be accepted to be interpreted by some as only a warning rule, because this one is related to a risk of false negative results, and this one is not related to a risk of false negative results. So, after the internal quality control, let's see the external quality assessment. So this is the last topic. What is an external quality assessment in qualitative tests? So, determination of the performance of laboratory tests through cooperations between laboratories. This is one of the definitions. A program in which multiple samples are periodically sent to the members of a group of laboratories for their analysis and identification, in which the results of each laboratory are compared with those of other laboratories of the group and or with an assigned value, and inform the participating laboratory and others. This is another well-known definition. In fact, what the EQA allows is to measure the laboratory result bias accuracy from a consensus value, the target, the goal. Thus, and following the illustration, arrows away from the target suggest biased results. So in this case, we have not a known significant bias because they are almost on the target. It is important to recognize that the bias that matters is the clinical one. That is the difference between the in vitro sample value and its in vivo concentration. Thus, the external quality assessment sample replicates the human sample, which is always a complex challenge, given the variability associated with these samples. How important is the homogeneity in results in EQA, external quality assessment? Homogeneity is, of course, the most crucial feature in assessing the robustness of the estimated biases. To be easier to understand, let's present a hypothetical case of EQA. On the x-axis, we have the analyte concentration measurements. The ordinate axis represents the numbers of measurements, almost always equal to the number of laboratories participating in the exercise. We can calculate the bias through the difference between the laboratory result and the mean of all results. So in this case, we have here the bias from a result, the difference from the result, the mean of other results. Or we can calculate the bias through the difference between the laboratory results and the mean of the results of a subgroup. In this case, we have a subgroup, for example, a subgroup of laboratories sharing the same method or sharing even better the same equipment, laboratory equipment. And in this case, of course, it's the same, it's a difference between our results and, of course, the average of the group. And this type of EQA, of course, is only possible when you are using ordinal results, because, of course, you need numerical results. So, in this first bias, when you are comparing the bias in an equal way against the average of all the laboratories, and they could share different methods, different types of equipment. So this situation, the bias is overestimated. But in the case you are using a subgroup, for example, as I said, the same method or preferably the same test, the result tend to be homogeneous, giving better confidence to the estimated bias. So the homogeneity is critical because in this case, we have an high heterogeneity, and high heterogeneity contributes, of course, to less chance of the mean to happen. So using a subgroup, you have, of course, a better homogeneity of the results. So this is a more powerful bias. Thus, it is essential to be sure enough about the homogeneity of the results to know the robustness of our bias. Now we'll look at two generic examples of bias estimation in EQA so that we can understand its importance in evaluating the performance of a test, but also when it can falsely estimate this performance. First, let's analyze homogeneity, which is always associated with variance, usually measured by the standard deviation. So in this case, the dispersion is low, which favors homogeneity. In other words, the biased result will already be estimated with some confidence. When calculating the difference between the laboratory results and the mean, we verify that associated with a short standard deviation, we have a high probability of this mean occurring, which again favors confidence in the bias. Thus, with some confidence, we can state that the bias has a low risk of not being representative of the difference to the in vivo value. So this is a good example of the application of an external quality assessment scheme. Now we'll see a case where the bias is falsely estimated, almost always overestimated, but it can also be underestimated. In this case, the dispersion is high, which favor heterogeneity. So here, of course, the results are mixed, include several types, as I said, in another slide of methods, for example, or tests. And of course, we have a high dispersion of results. So this is a case that contributes, of course, to lower confidence in our bias. So when estimating the difference between the laboratory results and the mean, we verify that associated with a wide standard deviation have a low probability of this mean occurring. As you see, if the standard deviation, of course, was lower, probably our average should be here, could be higher. So in this case, here, the average or the mean, of course, we have a lower chance to happen. So thus, we can with some confidence state that this bias has a high risk of not being representative of the difference for the in vivo value. In this case, we do not suggest the use of this bias in the assessment of performance tests. So what statistical tools to use with qualitative results? The mean, the standard deviation, the z-score, the percent error, and the combined measurement uncertainty are, of course, useful. Note what we observed in the graphics as the risk of heterogeneity is now replicated in mathematical models has some difference and standard deviations, as you can see on the mean, on the standard deviation, on the z-score, on the percentage of error, and of course, on the measurement uncertainty. We have, of course, here the contribution of means that could have a lower or high chance to happen, and of course, with the related imprecision here in the terms of the standard deviation. Note what we observe in these graphs are the risk of heterogeneity is now replicated as we saw to the mathematical models. It is in fact, these measurements will make the bias estimates more or less robust. So they are dependent of the confidence we have on the average and on the standard deviation. So first, it is important to know what the qualitative biased result is. First, it's important to know that the qualitative biased result is a false result. For example, a false negative result. Okay. For example, false negatives are a bigger problem in screening tests, as we checked the COVID pandemic, or as it happens in blood banks. A large number of proficiency tests are performed for properties that are measured or identified on qualitative scales. Binary results, true, false, positive, negative, reactive, non-reactive. Laboratory tests in areas such as blood bank, microbiology, and virology, HLA, and karyotypes. The associated reference value or certified value should normally be used as the second value for the round. Confirmatory tests or measurements are recommended whenever possible, especially when contamination may compromise use as a proficiency test item. When the segment values are based on examinations, for example, presence or absence, the segment value can usually be determined with some considerable confidence. Statistical calculations for uncertainty may be appropriate for measurement levels at indeterminate or equivocal levels, which is close to our problem. Each result is marked as acceptable if it is exactly match the assigned value, it is marked as unacceptable, or is given an adverse performance score otherwise. Results that exactly match the second value are marked as acceptable, given a corresponding score. Results that do not exactly match the second value are scored depending on the nature of the mismatch. So how to evaluate the performance using an EQA scheme? These models to evaluate the performance, they are not harmonized. Okay, so they differ with the issuer of the EQA program. So we could use several approaches. One is the misclassification in the score, MIS. So it corresponds to the number of discrepancies of the result of a reported analyte or misclassifications. The two samples submitted evaluation with respect to the result defined by consensus, either by reference laboratories or 80% of the total number of participants. So if the index score is equal to 0, there is no misclassification. So we could report as a good performance test. If the index score is equal to 1, misclassification of a sample result, so we classify as an indeterminate performance. If the misclassification index score is higher or equal or higher than 2 sample result. So we could classify as a poor performance. So it says 2 sample result misclassification. So an indeterminate performance should be a critical alert for screening tests in transfusion and transplantation labs, principally, even with samples with concentrations close to the cutoff. Let's see some study cases to see in practice the importance of the EQA scheme. The first case is for alanine aminotransferase. So this is here to see the difference between a quantitative and a qualitative test. So let's look at the first example and what actions to take. The percentage error must be measured first with results from the same tests, therefore pairs. Second, as data from the same method, and third, as data from the whole group. We note that the heterogeneity increases from pairs to group results, so we must be careful with data used in the calculation of bias. In this exercise, we see that with the exception of exercise number 4, this one, all the results have satisfactory performance, given that they have z-scores equal to or lower than 2. In fact, the z-score value used is absolute. For example, in exercise 4, this one, the value of 3.289 is the absolute value of minus 3.89. So the absolute value of C represents the distance between that row score X and the population mean in units of the standard deviation. So Z is negative when the row score is below the mean, positive when above. Return to the case, to the exercise number 4. Z-score is equal to or higher than 3. So we can classify the performance as unsatisfactory performance. While in the other exercise, the action was to maintain the lab practice. In 4, it was necessary corrective maintenance of the auto-analyzer and recalibration. Corrections applied to bias only, measured by percentage of error. Failures related to intra-laboratory variance have a low probability of being detected in the EQA program. Of course, for this, we have the internal quality control. We note that the measurement uncertainty was not considered in the validation of labs results. The uncertainty model was, as we discussed, is based only on the variance in number of participants in the group, which is not bias related and tends not to be representative of the laboratory variance. This uncertainty is typically overestimated. So this is a second case which is close to the previous. So let's see a third case. The third case is related to the qualitative tests. And in this scenario, of course, the EQE assessment is mostly done using binary results. So if you see the case 1 and the case 2, which of course very close, they use, of course, numerical results. We could only replicate these examples if you have an ordinal scale. But even in this type of situation, so when you have an ordinal scale with a cutoff, in these situations, most of the QA schemes are using binary data. So let's see 2 cases with binary data in qualitative tests. So this one is for an immunoassay for anti-IgG IgM SARS-CoV-2. So you are using, as I said, binary results. So serological tests are those that make it possible to detect into the patient's serums a specific immunoresponse directed against an infectious agent. They can be divided according to their clinical utility in screening, diagnostic, or confirmatory tests. The cutoff limit for a qualitative test is a threshold equal or above which the result is reported as positive and below the result is reported as negative, as we discussed previously. So the second value in this case was a confirmed positive sample result. So results that exactly match the second value are marked as acceptable and given a corresponding score. Here we have this one in green. Results that do not exactly match the second value are given a score that depends on the nature of this mismatch. Such scoring designs should assign lower scores to better performance to be consistent with other types of performance scores. So you could see in the example in yellow that of course we have an indeterminate assessment. In this case, we have of course poor assessment. We have in this case a sample that was the consensus result was a positive result and our result was negative. Okay. Finally, the EQA case for binary real-time PCR test results for SARS-CoV-2 RNA detection. In this case, the sample used had a clinically important concentration, that is, with triple the number of copies of the decision limit, that is, a low RNA concentration. In this example, there is an increment of results in all the exercise. So we could evaluate the performance, of course, as satisfactory. So in this case, all the good practice in the medical laboratory should be kept, should be, of course, maintained. So an action is, of course, not to change anything in the practice, but of course to keep the current practice because they are good practice. So we are now almost finalizing the presentation. So it's this is only to suggest, because we have published the book called Quality Control of Qualitative Tests for Medical Laboratories. All these approaches, of course, are included in this book, and other approaches, of course, in-depth discussions. So the book includes also a CD with some spreadsheets, and for the people that are interested, for example, on internal quality control or EQA or other performance assessment, as we saw with the clinical sensitivity and specificity, we have here further chapters. Okay, it is available on medlabquality.com, InterQC, and of course, and also on Amazon. Of course, the interested could also contact the quality academics. Well, so a conclusion. So we saw that the performance assessment involves, of course, should involve a qualitative thinking, including on internal quality control and external quality assessment. We saw, and let me repeat, that on the performance assessment, the two major, of course, measurements are the clinical sensitivity and the clinical specificity. Of course, we need to compute the clinical sensitivity and specificity. We need samples with the condition and samples without the condition. I said an example, for example, samples of true infected individuals and samples of individuals without an infection. This is on one example. Whenever we have a rare test where it's not possible to have a minimum number of true positive and true negative samples, of course, you could use the agreement of the results. that should be used only in that condition. Of course, when we are using the measurement of the results, we need to take all the care with the comparative tests. We talked also about the uncertainty of proportions. Certainty of proportions is enforced for statistically and clinically more robust assessment. We saw also that for the uncertainty of proportions, we need to take all the care with the number of samples used, because when you decide about a target 95% lower limit, you need to decide according to the number of samples. We saw also that on internal quality control, of course, you could not use the methodology that you use to compute the clinical specificity and clinical sensitivity. So you suggested simpler approach, as it is used, of course, in most of the laboratories. And finally, we discussed the external quality assessment, and we show that we need to take a lot of care, of course, with the heterogeneity of the results to be sure that the bias are, of course, statistically and clinically, of course, reliable bias. So it is important to demystify and access the uncertainties of quantitative tests in the medical laboratory. This is concept also introduced. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Dr. Paulo. Now we have some questions, if you agree. Okay, we can start. We have here a question from Panama. How often is necessary to perform verification of qualitative tests?
Okay. Hello. Okay, because when you have, I think the question is related to validation, right? But it could be because you should not, we should validate tests when, of course, the conditions on the first validation change it. For example, if you change, of course, the equipment, you could have a test, but if you have the equipment, or if you have a major change in equipment, you should validate again, because in the validation, if you determine the clinical sensitivity and specificity is for the conditions we have. If you change this condition, you should revalidate. So, for example, if you have a new equipment, of course, you should validate. Other example, if you have the same equipment, but if you change only, for example, the software, you need to see if should validate or not validate again. Another example of validation, if the prevalence, let's see the case for the hepatitis C virus. If you have a new type or subtype of virus in our population, of course, you need to validate again with a panel, including this new subtype of virus, because the validation we have is not representative of the new prevalence. Okay, so these are two examples of validation of moments where the validation should happen. ISO 15189, it requires that the test should be revalidated, but it is a laboratory that should identify in which condition the test should be validated. For example, if I have a test in one equipment during 15 years, and I have only one validation, of course, that is guaranteed not a good procedure. Okay. So
okay.
This is some cases, because these questions happens a lot of time. Okay.
Okay. The other part of the question is how to ensure the quality of rapid tests.
How to ensure the quality of rapid tests? Rapid tests, there are some limitations with rapid tests, of course, when we compare with tests in laboratory. And it's proposed, of course, for example, using rapid tests for a blood bank for the screening of biological agents in the blood bank is not a good practice, because if the manufacturer improve, of course, the manufacturer try to improve the rapid test, but you'll never have the performance of the test that is in laboratory. The problem is not only related to the test, it's all related sometimes to the sample that is collected. So the problem starts there. So the rapid tests, of course, if you don't have other choice, this happened a lot in this pandemic, in the COVID-19 pandemic. Of course, if it's the only choice, you should use rapid tests. But if you could use, of course, tests in the medical laboratory, that's the first choice. I remember that in the beginning of this pandemic, it was used a lot of rapid tests. So the number of false results, and principally, it's not only false negatives, but also false positive results, was of course a major problem, but that not happened. So even if the rapid test is improving, it can never have, of course, the same performance in the medical laboratory tests. By the way, given an example, here in Europe, you cannot use a rapid test to validate blood components. That is not, it's not an option for the medical laboratory. You could not use, for example, a rapid test to the screening of GIV or hepatitis C virus. That's not possible, because even if it's improved, you have a lot of problems, and as I said, including from the moment that you take the sample.
Okay, this is another one. What percentage of sensitivity and specificity should qualitative tests have to be clinical functional?
Yeah, this is about a question that a lot of the medical laboratory, the technicians used to place. If here you need to place into different areas. If you are a manufacturer of in vitro diagnostic medical devices, you need to fulfill this value that are required, for example, in Europe by the European Commission, or in the United States by the FDA. But if you are a medical laboratory, of course, you need to define your own values. For example, during the validation of the clinical chemistry tests, you have, of course, the target values in different tables, some, of course, with different values, but we have some tables. Here we don't have tables, so you need to decide what fits the purpose of your laboratory. Let me give two examples. For example, for the screening of GIV virus, if you are in a pathology laboratory, if you have, for example, a false negative result, you could ask to the patient a second sample, for example, 2 weeks later. So the false negative results is not a critical problem. But if you have the same test in a blood bank, if you have a false negative result, it's a big problem. Because if you have a false negative result, will infect someone. So the percentage in the blood bank must be 100%. But in the pathology laboratory, it could not be, it could be lower than 100%. So it should be used at the percentage according to the intended use of the test. But the number, it's not harmonized, so it is a problem in all the world. So the laboratory must decide the percentage. Of course, it could be different from the laboratories, but it should be according to the clinical interest of the test.
Okay, this from Colombia. What points, sorry. What points do you think a basic quality control program should include in a microbiology laboratory?
Hello, Colombia, but I didn't. What basic points should include?
What points do you think a basic quality control program should include in a microbiology laboratory?
Well, I understand points as statistical measurements to evaluate the performance assessment. I'm not sure if this is what is asked. This presentation was a time close to 130, so I introduced probably a lot of things, but only what is basic. So what is present, what is in this presentation is what is basic to evaluate the test, because there are a lot of other issues that could be evaluated. But of course, you need to know the clinical sensitivity and the clinical specificity. That's of course sure. Using using the same results that are using to compute the clinical sensitivity and specificity, of course, using a spreadsheet. I need to talk slowly because to the tradition. You could also use a spreadsheet to compute the uncertainty of proportions. Okay. So for the validation, of course, I understand this is the core measurements, because you know the chance to have positive results on, for example, infected people. You know the chance to have negative results on healthy people. And you know also the uncertainty of these results to happen. Of course, if you talk about internal quality control and EQA, that is different. But I think you was talking probably only about validation. Remember that for validation, you need to have all the care to choose the right samples. You couldn't, at this point, you could never use samples with results from another test. You need to take care that for clinical sensitivity and specificity, we need to have samples with diagnosis. Okay.
Okay, this question is from Carlos Alfredo Salas Cordova. How can we establish the true cutoff due to sometimes the manufacturer cutoff does not work with our population?
Well, this is from which country? Spain? No.
I don't know. I have only the name.
Yes, this issue, of course, was only briefly referred in the presentation, because this was not part of the presentation. But for you to determine the cutoff, usually you are using the receiver operational characteristics curves, the ROC curves. So to decide the cutoff, of course, you'll need to determine for several possible cutoff points the trade-off between clinical specificity and clinical sensitivity. So the cutoff is chosen about the trade-off of clinical sensitivity and clinical specificity. Usually this is done, as we know, at the manufacturers of in vitro diagnostic medical devices. And this only rarely performed when we have in-house tests. Because of course, usually the technicians used to have a fear, and that is easy to understand, a fear to choose their own cutoff. So most of the time, for in-house tests, the laboratories try to choose the cutoff according to what is published in the literature. Okay, so even to choose a cutoff in the medical laboratory, it's complex. For example, if you have a commercial test, if you choose a different cutoff, you start to have a modified test. So you could not only verify the test, you need to validate. But this could be a problem in some countries. Okay, so to compute a cutoff, it's always a complex issue. But of course, in the question, it's absolutely right. if a cutoff is computed using a population that is not the population, that is the population the population of the laboratory, of course, that could be a problem, because the cutoff is valid for the population where the data was taken.
Beatriz Asunción Paredes from Mexico. Is it valid when opening a new batch of pregnancy, HIV, HVS tests reagents? All are cassette. Take one cassette and iterate with positive or negative. Sarah, is this clear?
No.
Can I will read it in Spanish, could be? ¿Es válido al abrir un nuevo lote de reactivos de pruebas de embarazo, HIV, HBS, antígeno? Todos son cassette. Tomar un cassette y valorar con sueros positivos y negativos.
Yes, so this is just to the previous question. The book that we published discuss a lot about the cutoff. About this question, of course, is also a very, very important question, because the question is related to when we change different batches of reagents. Because, of course, we must, according to ISO 15189, we must, of course, to check if the new batch of reagent, the results are acceptable. And of course, my suggestion for the simpler approach is, and I say yes to what was placed in the question, is of course to use the internal quality control material. So if I have an internal quality control material using batch A, and if everything is stable in that quality control material, so we understand stable as the results are systematically in control. And if now I have a new batch, a batch B, for example, and if the results are systematically stable, again, in control, of course, that's not a problem. But of course, there is the problem if the results are out of control. Here we are dealing with qualitative results. So what is important here, it's that the results remain true positives and true negatives. So if I have a new batch, and of course, for example, the signal to cutoff ratio, the average and standard deviation could be different. Usually the problem is, of course, with the average, but if the average is different, but the results remain true positives, okay, so let's recalculate the average and the standard deviation. The problem here is complex if it's not only, for example, the signal to the cutoff ratio are different, but also if you have false results. This is a very, very rare problem, but of course, in this case, we have reasons to reject that batch and contact, of course, the supplier or even the manufacturer.
Thank you. This same lady is asking, she has many questions, but first one, is external quality control the best source of bias? Second one, when I have a calculated bias in an exercise with results with a large standard deviation, what should I do? And the third one, what is the importance of an SCC in qualitative tests when the sample are strongly positive?
Sorry, the NCC, I didn't understand that was part.
The first one, is external quality control the best source of bias?
Very good. The two first questions, that's fine. The third questions, I didn't understand.
What is the importance what is the importance of an SCC in qualitative tests?
I don't know what is NCC, sorry.
SCC. Okay, so we can work with the two first
I don't
questions.
understand that abbreviation. Sorry, could you repeat the first question? Because I know the second, but I forgot now the first, sorry.
Is external quality control the best source of bias?
No, it is not the best source of bias. And of course, the best bias for us, it was to know what is the concentration in vivo, but that's not possible to know. So, of course, in a qualitative test, first, if you are using a signal to cutoff ratio, it is possible to determine bias. It's not a good source of bias, but it could be in most conditions the only possible source of bias. But for example, if you are using in an external quality assessment, if you are using binary results, for example, positive, negative, a biased result is a false result. For example, if the consensus value of the EQA issuer is positive, and if my result is negative, in this situation, the EQA is a very good source of bias. Okay? In the case you are using the signal to the cutoff ratio, in this case, like in the question, when we have large standard deviation, this is only my suggestion. I think we could compute the bias, but just that, you should not use that bias. Because if we are comparing our value against a mean with a very large standard deviation, and that usually happens in the when we are mixing laboratories with different methods, different types of tests, there is a large heterogeneity of the results. So the chance for that average result to be close to the true value is very, very, very low. So, and you have a reason to have a low confidence bias. I'm sorry for the third question, but I didn't understand the abbreviation. Okay, I'm so here. QSC, I think, okay.
The next one, when I have a calculated bias in an exercise with results with a large standard deviation, what should I do?
Yeah, first the previous question. I think QSC is I think it's InterQC topics. I don't know, probably it's a software, something like that. That I don't know. Okay, about that question, as I told you, if you have an EQA scheme, let's start about a good example. I have an EQA scheme. I have a standard deviation and the mean for the laboratory mixing all the laboratories with different methods. But if we also have a subgroup, for example, with laboratories sharing the same test, and if this is the only source for me to determine the bias, this is a very good source, because if I have the laboratories sharing the same test, I have a good homogeneity of the results. So I have a good confidence that my bias is very close to the true bias. So in this case, I could, with confidence, use my bias. As I said, if I have a very large standard deviation, that's a reason for I don't have a confidence in my bias estimate. So in this case, I suggest use a bias as 0 till we could have a better confidence in a bias result. Because worse than to use a bias as 0 is towards a wrong bias.
Okay, could you share the bibliography of the 2017 IFCC guidelines that is freely available that was mentioned at the beginning of the session, please?
Yes, if you search, because the IFCC and the UPAC, the recommendations, you have a vocabulary. That vocabulary is part of the Clinical Chemistry and Laboratory Medicine journal, but the article is free. So if you write using the words that are placed, you could find this article. Of course, I could also send the link to Dr. Hugo Baez without any kind of problem. But it's from the Clinical Chemistry and Laboratory Medicine, but it's free, so you could download the article. You could also download the EuroChem CTAC guideline. If you go to the CTAC, to the EuroChem site, you could find the guideline. It's also free.
Okay, Carlos Alfredo Salas, Córdoba. What should we do when we've got an event out of control, like in ELISA?
Yes. So when you say out of control, remember that we are talking, I don't know if you are talking about Levy-Jennings shards or if you are talking an attribute shards. Attribute shards, to remember, because is when you are using only with binary results. So if you are using an attribute shards, for example, I have a sample that I know that is a true positive samples, and if in my analytical run today, I have false negative results, of course, I cannot report these results. And I need to check, of course, what happens, because this is a critical issue, because we should replicate the sample results to the human samples, okay? So this is a situation that could happen. So we need to check if everything is okay, if the quality control results, the positive or negative, are according to the manufacturer. We need to see, we should not do wrong things like to check the sample against something that we don't use to check with the human samples. But there are a lot of causes that could contribute to that systematic error when we have a false result. This is rare, but could happen, okay? But if you have a Levy-Jennings shards, we are not using a binary result, so you don't have only a positive sample, so you have a positive sample, but with a known segment to cutoff ratio. So if you have an out of control result, and if you remember the chart that I presented, if the result is out of control, but if it's lower than the average, so there is a risk of false negative results. So we need again to check everything in the test. If the test passes the results of the manufacturer, but in this case, we need, of course, to reject all the samples from the analytical run. But in this situation, using the segment to cutoff and the Levy-Jennings shards, if the result is out of control, but if it's higher than the average, this could be only a warning, because, and you could accept, this is only suggestion, you could accept the analytical run samples. Why? Because we saw result with a lower chance to happen, but here the risk is to have false positives, not false negatives. So it's not problem to report that kind of results. So, as I said, we need to use a qualitative thinking to interpret these charts, and not, of course, never a quantitative thinking.
Okay, also from Carlos Alfredo Salas. In the EQA for RNA SARS-CoV-2, can we use the CT for quantitative evaluation?
The CT, sorry?
CT, cutoff maybe?
CO?
The CT, this is what he says. city?
I don't know what is city, but let's thinking about when we talk about real-time PCR, they are, of course, the principles are different from the immunoassay because as we know, in a PCR test, usually the result, for example, copies per milliliter, always extremely low or extremely high. So this is not the same situation like immunoassays that you have a high risk to have results close to the cutoff, and that it happens in infected individuals during, of course, the serial conversion. So to use, for example, the copies per milliliter in the levogenics charts, the situations is very, very close to use an attribute charts only with positives and negative results, because we have only very, very low results and they used to have extremely high results. So it's very different because so my suggestion for PCR tests is only using the attribute charts, not the levogenics charts. We could use, but it's not useful. It's almost the same thing because the values are at extreme.
Okay. We have now, hello, Dr. Rosa Isabel.
Hello, Hugo. I'm very sorry about this problem. It was completely out of my hands.
Don't worry and welcome.
We have a very, very strong wind, kind of hurricane, okay? And that's why we lost all the connections, no electricity until now. I hope it stays for a little bit longer. Thank you.
Okay, we have here from Ruth Coral. If she's from Proasecal, Colombia. Can I use patient samples as sites by a state-of-the-art analytical platform as an internal control for rapid tests?
Yes, of course, it could be used as patient samples. The use of patient samples, of course, the only problem is related to the stability of the sample. So if you are using, for example, sample using a rapid test, probably the result we know it's only positive or negative. So if you have a sample from a patient with a diagnosis, that is a perfect sample. But this is allows us to use, of course, different samples in different days, because you only need to know if the sample is, in this case, a true positive. So that's fine. Because if you are using a human sample during, for example, 2 or 3 weeks, there are a lot of problems with the stability of that sample, and that's not correct. So if you are using a human sample to test if the result is true, my suggestion is, of course, probably to frozen the plasma or the serum, and of course, it could be used, and of course, a perfect sample to be used. No problem at all.
So Hugo wants me to continue with the questions. If we have more questions, please, Moni, send those to me. Anyway, it has been really good. Even I was not able to listen to you, Paulo, but the questions are fantastic.
Yeah.
I really think it was great that you could participate. You know, very often this type of testing is missing a lot of understanding and knowledge, and also good information. So it's really nice. I think we should promote this type of presentations. Perhaps we ask you in the future to give us another one, okay? There is one more here. It says from Carlos Olivares Hernandez. It says, is the rapid COVID antigen test, how will you handle the quality control in the rapid antigen test for COVID?
No, the quality control is common to any other type of qualitative tests, because unfortunately we have a lot of samples with positive results. So because we could use, of course, human samples when we have samples that are, of course, we need to use samples that are true positives. So we could also use, you could, of course, purchase samples, but that, of course, it's always costly. But if you are only interested to see if the result of our test is a true positive, of course, no problem to use, of course, human samples, because, of course, frozen human samples in liquids and using during same times. Here, for in this situation, to change from a patient to another, so it's the batch, it's not a major problem. Of course, we need to choose, of course, the sample with a concentration close to the cutoff. But in a rapid test, you don't have information to do that. Of course, you could only do a series of dilution of that kind of samples to do that. But this is a perfect situation. But a situation that you have a patient that is positive and you try to see if the result is systematically positive use that sampling, I think is a good approach. The best approach is, of course, to make a series of dilutions to see what is the minimum dilution with positive results, and possibly using that dilution or the next dilution. But I think using human samples, as I said to the other question, is, of course, it's a good solution.
Good. There is another one from Andrea Rangel. It's in microbiology identification equipment, how will it be applied?
What is identification equipment in microbiology? What is identification of the types of the bacteria, of the microorganisms?
Well, she doesn't say. It was just general question, I guess. So we'll move to the next one.
Yes, but just to note, because
okay,
when you talk about qualitative, the minimum you could have for an internal quality control is to know the condition of the sample and to see if the test reports that kind of condition. So I need to know always the condition. It could be the condition. We could are trying to do any type of test, but we need to know what is the expected result, what is a true result, and we need to compare with our results. So this is a rule that we could use in all the types of tests, including for the blood, when I'm doing the blood grouping. So we could apply this condition to all the types of tests.
Okay, well, it seems that she got an answer. Okay, thank you. Another one from Jorgelina Berer. It's a quite long one. Regarding the state of the art, it is difficult to establish if we do not have the values of the external controls. Because only qualitative information is reported. In other words, for HIV result, is reactive or non-reactive. So PR is not reported in the external evaluation program. So I think it's kind of a comment more than a question.
Yes, but that's what's happened with almost all EQA schemes. So in that condition, we could only determine if our result is biased. And as I said in another question, of course, if the consensus result of the EQA issuer is a positive, and if our result is negative, of course, we have a problem because our result is biased. If our result is positive, it's not biased. So if it's biased, we need to take, of course, an action because we have a problem.
Okay. Let's see. One more is from Esperanza Giraldo. What kind of bibliography recommendation for qualitative microbiology analysis do you recommend?
Well, that's not really my area, but the specific area, because I have done my PhD, it was in microbiology, but a lot of literature is general, could be applied, including my book. But of course, there are a lot of guides published by the CLSI, the Clinical and Laboratory Standard Institute, specific for these types of tests. So they're not free, they need to pay, of course. You could try to the literature, but the CLSI guides, of course, are the most recommended, because they try to harmonize the practice in that field.
CLSI, yes. Okay, good. And I think this is the very last one from Guadalupe Barbara. It says, can the book you wrote be purchased in Mexico?
Sorry, what?
Your book. Can we buy your book in Mexico?
It could be, because I have the book was sold to a lot of places, including a lot of countries in South America. So you could use a site, it's medlabquality.com, or the Westcard QC website, or the Amazon.
Very good. Well, I think this is all. Do you have something else, Hugo, or you, Paolo, would you like to say anything else about it?
No, I think it was, I really love to have a lot of questions, and all, as you said, all good questions and important questions. These are most of the questions that happens in the field. So I think that was very, very, very nice. I will send also the PDF for you. I have done a small mistake, because there was a couple of slides in Spanish, but you understand Spanish, so no problem. but that happened because it was from a previous presentation about the EQA. But I could send the PDF of the presentation, so and you could share by the participants here in the lesson.
Well, you have a lot of congratulations.
Okay,
People enjoy it very much, like it very much. So thank you very, very much, Paolo.
You too.
We have had more than 200 participants, and thank you really, Paolo. It was very nice session. It was our first InterQC topic session, so we really appreciate your participation. We enjoyed a lot. Thank you everyone to participate. It was very nice how to receive many questions. And well, this is the first one. We will let you know about the second and the others ones. Something
Okay.
else?
No.
Doctora Rosa Isabel? Well, Doctora Rosa Isabel, ¿algo más?
No, gracias a todos por su participación, las preguntas muy buenas. Thank you very much, Paolo. It's very nice talk, conference. We would like to have also
Okay, thank you so much and see you next time. Thank you, Paulo. Have a very nice Saturday evening.
Bye-bye for you too. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Thank you for all.